Hello, everyone. In today's episode, I'm going to attempt to give the episode with my eyes closed. And it's another way of saying where I'm not going to mute the cough zone. Briefings beyond manifestation. Where do the rivers of imagination lead? Human beings have been fascinated by communication, simply because it is their only outlet. As a creature in a world, we are divided into a conceptual position and a contextual position. On some deep level, the human experience is acquainted with its own absence. Prior to ideological meaning, a hidden language of being has been spoken by the natural world. There is an intelligence that is present before it defines itself. You know, imagine a time traveler going back in time, looking at the earliest human beings who didn't know how to speak yet, and just being in the fascination that, let's say, those cavemen didn't know how able, and it's not that, okay, let's say voice box control of an organism wasn't developed yet, or maybe it was, but it's as if the earliest human beings had no idea what sophisticated structures of reality would be expressed from our mouths, you know. What evolution has been the realization or the treasured revelation of the small and the big. Right now, the human experience is limited to the consciousness of the individual. And consciousness has a boundary, and that boundary, in the inner realms, it does come to belief, but in the outer realms, that boundary is transparent. The biggest question for the conscious entity can be said to be its response to change, to shape. Why is a shape of a changing world here? We human beings, on some level, all our desires have a shape. you know. Regardless of whether what we seek is good or bad, right or wrong, it has a shape. And intelligence recognizes itself through shape. And so the question comes, if manifestation is the realm of shape, what would a briefing beyond manifestation be like? What is there to say beyond the world where our limits exist? Fear, love, the constant dance and spiraling of shaken structure and organized chaos. If human beings consider that behind their eyes there is a different kind of freedom than they can find ever in front of their eyes, and if the human effort utilizes its unknown variables, as if strategies through a known dimension have a sort of outcome, and imagine strategies in an unknown way that intelligence is present. Pretty much, it's as if like, what is the agenda of our known conscious life? And what sort of possible fathomable agenda can that which lurks alive in the unconscious have? If we look at evolution and keep asking ourselves, why? Why have we survived? It has been for the recognition of expression. Those of the ancient world acknowledged the purpose of the individual consciousness being the entertainment of the collective consciousness. It's as if, you know, when you look at the archetype of man, for example, there were mythologies where there were gods and men, or the concept of demigods, or the ultimate inconceivable God. But if we go to a time prior to monotheistic perception, you look at the archetype of the human being, and because the human being has an ending, its purpose of action becomes quality-oriented. But if the concept of a God or let me use an ancient Greek example. So we have the human being, then we have demigods, let's say Hercules. Then we have gods like Zeus, for example. The human archetype is being defined by its temporary situation. You know, pretty much the meaning of life is what do you do with the time given, or as the poet Rumi and very wisely says to them, creatures of this conscious realm. Before death takes away all that is given, give away all there is to give. The nature of a temporary human archetype is performance-oriented. most creatures in this realm, their relationship with the divine is performance-based. And their performance is fueled by the origin of their consciousness, which for every human being is an initial intent. It's as if we weren't just born, we had a momentum before consciousness emerged. So it's as if something builds up to consciousness, and the way it builds up, it's an intent. It would be equivalent to somebody having a glass of water. And let's say you have a glass of water, pour this into a swimming pool, and then you have a glass of water in which you spin the cup as you're pouring the water in the swimming pool. And so there's a sort of curvature to the water before it impacts the water. Or you could say it's similar with like skipping stones on a pond. The way it is thrown suggests momentum. When I look at human beings and their karma, to me it feels like poetically, how far has God thrown the soul? Or with what momentum, with what intent? And for the human archetype, the greatest realization of a performer, that it's another way of saying your eyes have opened and the performance has begun. And the greatest realization of the performer is to not only play its part, but to realize it is not just the performer, and then it becomes conscious of the audience beyond the stage. If we go to the demigod archetype, the demigod archetype is that which knows it is divine. And there's a lot of demigod archetypal figures in mythologies. There's, for example, Hercules in the Greek tradition, and in, you can say, Persian culture, we have a sort of figure inspired by the poet. I forget the poet that inspired Greek mythology, Helios or something. But there's a poet that has inspired a lot of Persian mythology. Hopefully I will do this justice in my lifetime and explain all of Persian mythology to the world. But there was a poet called Ferdowsi, and he wrote this book, this poetry collection called the Book of Kings. And in it he explained of a divine figure named Rostam. Rostam would be like the Hercules in that part of the world. Rostam was this divine warrior, literally a warrior who it didn't matter what archetype it fought, the momentum it arose in the realm, its consciousness it arose in the realm was undefeatable. There are beings like that. I personally feel when it comes to speech or communication, there's something very familiar, how everything in manifestation has a ritualistic component. But anyways, the poet so we have the archetype of Rostam, we have the archetype of Hercules. I don't want to get into religious archetypes, such as prophets, because, the theological context has its own unique appreciation. But it would be as if, I'll go back to Hercules. There was something moving, coursing through the veins of Hercules, which had in some sense, you could say, a beyond the world component, as if Hercules had a strength beyond this world because a part of him was beyond this world. The demonstration of skill and talent is very similar. When you see some people who are gifted, for example, musicians, To me, their mind, let's say their mind space has already a familiarity with that movement. Even me giving these talks, while giving them, it hasn't been as if like memories have rushed to me, but my imagination and my inner realms has moved as if it is acknowledging its own life. The human mind is a platform for communication. Its purpose is communication. If the purpose of the body is to survive, the purpose of the mind is expression oriented. It's as if some part of our minds know that they're not objects, so they don't have the similar fears of an object, so their purpose isn't based on what they feel. It's another way of saying the mind interprets fear, but it cannot fear it, the interpreter. When it comes to the archetype of the demigod, it is acceptance of a self that is beyond. It's as if, like, on Father's Day, Hercules, stared at the clouds of the dawn. When it comes to, for example, the archetype of a god or Zeus, it's as if a god does not have the fear of a temporary existence to define it. It's as if, what would the psychology of an undefeatable, uninterruptible force look like? Or it's another way of saying, can eternity get bored and play games? The ancients would say that human life is the game of the gods. But little did they know that the gods were their own future selves. Reality has an incredible sophistication, where rather than it being a straight line, it's literally like a right angle starting from the point that connects both. There is a rhythm to life where once you find that rhythm, you recognize the experiencer is beyond an archetype itself. Right now, I'm attempting to speak about demigods and gods, but really when I look at modern culture, this is how we know it's psychologically de-evolving a bit, because the fascination of the human being has gone to demi-humans, right? For me, I understand, like, let's say Japanese girls find it cute that there's like, cat ears on someone, but on some level that's a demi-human archetype, where it's as if the responsibility of man has become so burdensome that it's like it's easier to revert to what we were before, right? It's pretty much a choice. Who was it, Aristotle, where it says, those who are content with loneliness, or those human beings who can be alone strangely for like long periods and whatnot. It's as if they are either a beast or they are either a god. So it's like the implication that how do you resolve whatever sort of energetic expression you are, and do you acknowledge beyond yourself, or do you not? Its attention breathes through various forms. It must recalibrate. To the contentment of a field of activity. As if the purpose of human life was never to remain human. But it wasn't a sort of dehumanized, personalized archetype either. It's this poetic thing where it's like there's these people trapped inside a simulation, and the simulation's being entertainment for higher dimensions, and the greatest entertainment would be like as much of a fascinating thing, where I would say if it's like it's like a human being poetically meeting the gods is equivalent to like a character in a video game on the screen of the computer jumping out or suddenly noticing the person who's moving. Where imagination leads is towards constant discovery. Imagination is another way of moving non-physically. And in order to move non-physically, we need to have a non-physical body, and technically we do have that in 2022. Philosophers call it an abstract object. It's as if a quality of a changing world is to make sure that the past cannot become lost. Really, a moving system cannot be turned into a photograph. This should resolve all conflicts of static truth. Life is a dynamic truth. And it's all about the ability to acknowledge what is here. For example, a human being that speaks about imagination is a human being that is acknowledging, okay, my eyes were open, I saw something, but when I close my eyes, I can still see something. And how does that move? How does the wilderness of the mind move? Doctrines and doctrines born in this world just for their users to realize they are beyond it. You see, it's as if the unknown waited to be known. Now the known has no other choice, and it's waiting to be unknown. But if a being, any conscious being, realizes the unknown, then the problem of their knowledge is completely restructured. It's like the context shifts. It's like your whole life, you thought you were something, you thought you were some name, you thought you were a sequence of memories. But what is going on does not need to be just filtered through human discrimination. The only way the human mind will find itself capable to make any sort of extraterrestrial, let's say in quotations, unknown, interdimensional, whatever type of contact, is if it considers itself to be in the same room. If we all consider that the world is meaningless, that would become our masterpiece. Emptiness will be our masterpiece. But if we consider 8 billion creatures that their minds have a sort of generative potential, if 8 billion beings for a moment come into a singular agreement, something that has never happened in human history, because there's never been the consideration to consider that our own multidimensionality can be seen in others. It's like religions say, like, what is it, the golden rule? Do unto your neighbor as you expect to be done unto you. So similarly, it's to consider the multidimensional position that we are in within others as well, and to recognize every person is a unique antenna, and their potential is based on how honest they are. Because what honesty means is that the being did not seek for the original. It's like some things, actually, some treasures, there's no map to them. Imagine you're a treasure and you're looking for yourself, and it's like you've been looking through different maps only to realize it's like as simple as it is to drink a cup of coffee. It's as simple to discover the nature of one's being. It's instantaneous recognition. It's as if the mind just has to fathom, what would I be if I was free from myself? It's as if you would be beyond this stuff. Imagine you're walking in a garden, and you think that the garden is filled with flowers in general analysis. But then you look closely and you see that all the flowers are different. We are occupants of the space-time continuum as an unknown intelligence. The moment we can consider ourselves a person, we must not fear imagination's ability to present the archetype of the person, because in all of our memories there is an individual archetype of ourselves, or let's say most of our conscious memories. That conscious archetype, it's as if a memory can be disguised as imagination with a bit of a shift. It's pretty much like the mind has an ability to fathom itself as a person. This is a development, and when the mind could see itself through a person archetype, as a person, then it began saying, wait a minute, could objects be alive? Could in some sense the world be a person? The idea of God, for example, or an inconceivable persona. And then, if we were to close our eyes, the question would go on to, could our imagination also be found in a personalized archetype, like as a person? And when you see children, young children, There's this thing, I was reading this article where it was saying like a lot of young children have imaginary friends. And it's as if their mind, their imagination, has enough freedom to animate through some sort of personifiable archetype, There's something, for example, in the animated movie Spirited Away, where there's this like innocent girl who finds herself in this like strange, strange world. And there's like this weird ghost that appears, and the weird ghost is animated in accordance to the innocent nature of that girl. It's another way of saying the mind is already demonstrating the ability to be a living human being, a living person. So the mind, when one, let's say, closes their eyes and just stares into that pitch black abyss at first, but then, it's as if like right behind it or layered over it, then the visual images of memory and imagination come. It's like our eyes technically are seeing our eyelids, not the result of the pitch blackness, but because all the other senses are indifferent, just because the eyelids closed, still the projection of realism is there in the rooms. So if we have an ability to personify the our own elemental existence, the next step, or I shouldn't say next step, but it's like the next possibility we have is to personify our inner realms. Now, a person's imagination, this is the freedom we find in imagination, where a person can choose to see, like, oh my God, am I talking to an angel right now? The person can be like, imagine a cube. Imagine there's like this golden cube or this light blue cube, and it's just like you can, just by giving it, attributing it speech in the inner realms, you personify it. Pretty much because we're a person, anything we interact with, it filters through how we're being a person. And so it's as if, you know what it is, just like, it's like when somebody, for example, closes their eyes, and the idea of the logos was this inner guiding voice that Heraclitus spoke about, and Socrates called it the inner oracle, and whatnot. So it was as if there was like, simultaneously overlaid onto the moment a dimension where man's ears had an ability, or man's physical senses copy-pasted in the inner realms had an ability to receive, right? So it's as if the body is required so that there's an individuation point, so there's a separation. It's as if like we are kind of like, cell phones of the divine. So the inner realms have a capability to be personified. And so let's say, just like we have, like, let's say a master swordsman back in the day, let's say there was this kid and, his father had died in, like, let's say in ancient Rome, his father had died in battle, and this kid just went to the forest and just grabbed the sword and just practiced, like, sword fighting, swordsmanship. So as if it's like a physical action, and the person has an ability to concentrate, which is another way of saying becoming totally conscious of something. And then the person expresses, and accumulates various memories of, let's say, inner realm to outer realm presentation. So, just like, let's say, this person is mastering, like swordsmanship, like that's a metaphor. So now let's say a human being wanted to master imagination. You did not just want to say to have imagination or think you're creative and all of that. You wanted to master. In some sense, it's as if you wanted to. It's like the ancients would say, the mind is a lousy master but a great servant. And so the question comes, how do we master the mind that is mastering us? And the initial idea is that most people in esoteric circles, they think that you have to serve the mind. This is not wrong. It's a possibility, but the issue is that the accumulation is done. It's as if a person doesn't claim how their attention is being in their moment, they don't exist in their moment to some degree. So if somebody is working with, let's say, hilariously a sort of divine agency, divinity being considered as unknown. In the efforts to master imagination, a human being has to have the initial courage to look at everything that is being then in one moment. That means it's as if like a first revision of our own perceptions origin. And so the human being must find a moment that they cannot doubt. Human beings have different psychological conditions, so this comes differently for different people. For example, for René Descartes, he doubted everything until he came to the point where he couldn't doubt the isolated thinking subject, and then he concluded the mind is standing in a different dimension. You know? To me, René Descartes' mind-body dualism is an implication that René Descartes has been one of the most honest human beings on this planet. One of the most fascinating, as if his eyes, had a certainty from the future. On some level, if we say that if somebody, let's say, wants to master an instrument, they gotta use it and play it. To master imagination, it's like we gotta use and play what we are. Now, I would say I am a person who has attempted this, getting close to 2,000 times. And aside from the allure of a completely different world, one can probabilize reality. It's like when somebody looks, let's say you see a skateboarder and somebody's skateboarding, and so a person can look at that skateboard and be like, okay, it can fall. The person can fall, the person can do a cool trick. There's different probabilities that arise from that skateboard, right? That skateboard. Now, a person can, let's say, simultaneously imagine a hoverboard and wonder about what would the tricks of a hoverboard be. It would most likely be like using two hoverboards or being able to be upside down on a hoverboard, I don't know. But pretty much what I'm saying is that the hoverboard doesn't exist yet. It exists in the realm of imagination. The person was looking at reality. They fathomed the hoverboard. It's like the inner layer of their mind began to see something solidify in the outer realm now. So pretty much what I'm trying to say is imagination, you can't touch it physically, but it's engageable in the way that attention can move it. So imagination is kind of like, you draw one line, then you draw another line, and then eventually you have drawn so many lines that so many different lines can emerge from it. Personally, I draw very unique geometric art, and the way I draw it is like I've said it to others, or maybe in one talk I said it, where I sprinkle chaos and ordered elements in it. What that means is there's some moments in life where if a person just for a second stops thinking chaos and order is good or evil, but thinks of chaos and order being in some sense structure and its absence. It's as if imagine order was a straight line, chaos was a curved line. It's as if I would draw a couple straight lines, and then I would allow my emotions to move my hand in regards to, projecting count. What do you call it? You allow your eyes in all dimensions to be able to see. Pretty much. That means it's as if really what mastery is in a changing world, trying to, not solidify but promote. It's it's an instantaneous confidence in knowing what will happen. The mastery of the mind is very different than the mastery of an object. But let's say a person I'll go back to this metaphor, a person using a sword. The person just has to move the sword in the conscious waking state. They just have to be able to, master, the movement of the body. The really fascinating thing about the body is a person can have an expectation of how, their mind can envision a sort of movement, and they may think that their body's following up on that, but it doesn't do it, let's say, with 100% efficiency. So it's as if even there could be a huge philosophical, fascinating conversation on, is our certainty or is confidence coming from within us, or is it coming from outside of us? If mastery in the outer realms is repetition until the outcome is attained, mastery in the inner realms is a bit different, because there's intelligence there. And so it's like when you want to master your body, it's like the body doesn't have its own mind. Some schools of thought consider that, but I think that's too much. What it is that, the body, there's a stability of existence. A person can imagine different things. It's like, let's say you're standing, let's say you're standing in a balcony. And so in your mind, you can imagine yourself, let's say, hovering in the air, but the body is still there, and the nature of visual existential content, and pretty much I shouldn't say just visual, but it's like our senses. It's like existence is a type of imagination that doesn't change by the whim of our attention. But when we close our eyes and we truly access the inner realms, and we're content with the emptiness in all dimensions, that means this is the most important thing. If a human being is not content with emptiness, if they are not content with the absence of meaning, then they will either be a sort of bewildered beast searching for meaning, or they have to wait for the meaning to be given to them or fed to them. The idea is that There is an advanced potential within every conscious moment, whether it knows it or not. As if there is a hidden gift within everybody. As if that which is within you has an ability, an untapped yet ability. To master the mind, one has to release themselves from owning their mind. So it's this strange thing where the person thinks that it's like, let's say as a reaction to that ancient yogic statement that the mind is a lousy master but a great servant. It's like the person's like, okay, that means I'm gonna master my mind. So they so they have this intense attitude of thinking that mastery means control. But true mastery leads to a point where there's a contentment, a pure contentment where the control initially comes from. The purity of nature. The greatest warriors, they're not in battlefields, they're already walking in the fields of victory. It's another way of saying when somebody attains a mastery of something, the master no longer identifies as a master because it has reached the edge. This concept of teachers is actually just like part of the story. It's like the teacher is like a sort of evolution, but beyond the evolution of the teacher. You know, it's like first the person is a student of, let's say, a person with humanized information. And then afterwards, you begin noticing non-known variables of perception and reach a certain point where you become students of the life of the world. And so every moment is technically its own sort of divine revelation. So one cannot just try to control something, or thinking that mastery is an egoic grasp. In order for somebody to be capable to master their mind, it's this notion that the mind has a mind of its own. Just take this in for a second. Imagine your mind was a type of entity separate from you. And imagine this mind, we put it in the poetic archetype of, let's say, a warrior. Imagine your mind is a warrior. And so the mind is wondering about who to follow. That means imagine somebody's mind. We have this concept, for example, in wolves, where there's alpha wolves and beta wolves. Now imagine somebody has, for example, their body is in a beta position and their mind is in an alpha position. So their emotions, and it's like the content of their emotions is kind of like controlling the body. Now I'm saying the mind has this archetype of an alpha, and let's say the body has this archetype of the beta, and it's this way of saying the person wants to master their mind who's already being controlled or mastered by their own mind. And again, the ancient quote says the mind is a lousy master. The whole point of it is that the one's own mind, this is a very strange statement to say, but it's as if one's own mind has to find a way to honor that which is actually interacting with the mind. So it's another way of saying that illusion is a sign of a dishonored mind. mind has to see a great performance from the soul. You know, imagine there is the soul walking in a world and it notices the mind, and let's say the soul serves the mind. That means your soul, imagine there's the soul is the general, the mind is the commanding officer, and the body is the soldier. Now imagine the general walking alone who doesn't have a commanding officer. And the general sees a being that has the ability and potential to be a commanding officer. And so the general saves the mind. That means when you save someone, it's another way of saying you have given them an opportunity to honor you. And so it's like, imagine the soul saving the mind, and the mind suddenly has honor and has allegiance. Now imagine the soul and the general and the commanding officer are walking, and suddenly they see a soldier. They see a body. And so how the general and the commanding officer save the body from itself. Then it's as if, like, poetically, the army of life is established. So what I'm trying to say is that what we are, let's just for the sake of, to honor the ancient spiritualists, metaphysicists, let's say that we are a soul. And so the soul wants to master its mind. And so first it must see what situation its mind is in, and then poetically save it, and most likely save it from itself. There's this concept that I didn't know. I realized this after I created the Mr.Within channel, that there's like some ideas where people think evil also comes from within a person. And I mean, on some level, it's like intent is an internal event. But what is within us is beyond the good and evil that it manifests. So it's a poetic way where your unknown witnessing soul must acknowledge the presence of your mind, the position of your mind. And then when your soul saves your mind honors your soul, which is another way of saying your soul poetically, that inconceivable witness. It has a mental allegiance. The inner realms listen through the honor of prior service. Now, when it comes to the mind, and so the soul saved the mind, and now there's a sort of soul mind, and so let's say the soul mind tries to save the body. This is really what this human lifetime is. The idea is not that we are our body. The idea is not that we're our mind. The idea is that the origin of consciousness, through its allegiance of its mind, that means it brings its mind into its allegiance. The soul brings the mind into its allegiance, and then it has an ability to save the body. And so when I say save the body, it's not saving the body from danger, but it's another way of saying the general is acknowledging the potential of the commanding officers in the army. So the idea is that a person establishes honesty, and they come to realize, and to the simple instantaneous acknowledgement, all right, I'm an unknown viewer, I'm an unknown intelligence looking out through my eyes. Everything else is just stickers we attach later. So when a person is established and they can trust that unknown viewer within. That means they have trusted a state of their being prior to ideology or any sort of language, whether it's mathematical, geometrical, or storytelling. Stories are hidden. They're pretty much you can say, they're the films of language. Like film is a language. To literally, in film schools they teach about, the language of cinema. It's like what scenes bring with what worlds and audiences is. So, in the efforts of, so let's say a person has been honest enough to accept how they're being before whatever they do. And so they have also had the ability to truly, as whatever nature the unknown viewer is first bestowed, to try to comprehend their mind. And people are going to be like, Mr. Within, this is an impossible task. There's so much of survival we have to deal with. Why should we care that we're a mind? Because why are we surviving? A lot of people are too busy to wonder about why they're even here. But the mystery stands and the future generations, await our approaches. So, what seemed complicated became simple. What felt like the mind's karma overruling the free will. The moment the free will realized it's free, that's when the mind honors it. So it's another way of saying those who know that they are being unconditionally prior to the psychological simulation of a conditional life. It's as if when you are, no verb can be ascribed when you are your presence. When you are present within the universal presence, that means everything's being present. If right now there's, let's say, gods, or there's a god, or there's any sort of, let's say, extraterrestrial interdimensional entities or whatever, we're all present. That's the beautiful thing. And the equality that manifestation bestows, that means nobody exists less than others. The type of existence in the stories that project are different, right? Because really what defines an entity is how, like it's like the snowball effect of an individual archetype. The mind, and those who want to study their inner realms, a really good metaphor can be that it's a canvas. And so, at first, you are painting what's in the canvas. So memory, visualization, thinking, all of this is like free will and unknown free will painting, knowledge and movement. Now, the idea is who is moving the brush of imagination. Or it's another way of saying, let's say a person has, because it's like an honest soul that has recently found the allegiance of its mind. How would this honest soul understand the capability of its mind? And this is where communication is necessary. And this is strange to say again. Why? Because I am saying, from a mystical context, advanced communication, establishing communication with your own intelligence and its dimensions. A person can master what is in front of their eyes. Repetition grants that. But to master what is behind our eyes is the novelty of creation. Again, it is important to be remembered. Those who understand instantaneous freedom are ahead in this game. Because it's all granted. That's what emptiness means, you know. Emptiness is the possibility of the impossible. So, initial point, I would say, whoever you are, instead of just trying to be an artificial good person or being a careless bad person, for a second wonder that nobody on this planet has an access to your mind the way you do. And if somebody wants to comprehend the abilities and natures of their mind, they have to find a resolution beyond fear and love, beyond duality. It's like order thinks it has to love chaos, and chaos, order thinks it has to fear chaos. And chaos thinks it has to constantly rebel against order. It's as if the mind of this universe seems a bit confused. It can't make up its essence, its manifest essence. It can't make up its mind. It's like the universe can't make up its mind whether it wants stuff to exist or not. It's like, make up your mind, universe. You know, it's like it's like you want the void to have content or no content. And an incredible technique can be used is not just trying to imagine things, but to listen to your mind's voice. That means there's a voice that one moves through the free will. And if somebody doesn't do anything, they will start to hear voices. At first, these voices can be traced back to certain memories where they spoke. That means it's like when somebody remembers, let's say, you know, a time where they were somewhere, it's as if the audio files are also preserved. The audio files of that memory are still accessible, you know, whether in the unconscious or conscious. So at first, the person thinks that their mind is taunting them, or playing a game with them, or in certain extreme cases of those people where their psychology becomes fragmented, it's as if the hysteria there, it's pretty much like fear allows them to be possessed by the unconscious because they didn't value their consciousness. To me, fear has always been like a warning sign, like a warning notification, you know, or in some sense, something where the moment's possibility to enter the unknown is like being shortened. To treat your mind as a friend that you trust. Let's say those young children, you know, who see imaginary friends, or they're playing, you know, let's say with toys or something, or they think their toys are alive or like, you know, when children play, they think they are their toys. That's an incredible ability of allocating identity to where the attention is. And the idea is that we either have to make the initial claim, is the imagination lifeless or is it filled with life? To me, no offense, but materialism is incredibly boring. It's as if it's like the starting, you know, it's like, yeah, I see existence, but what else? That what else is, it's like the mysteries of the world are more fascinating than theistic and atheistic answers. It's like the question. You know, it's like every ideological system, most of them, people people access it because they want an answer from it. But philosophy is this incredible algorithm in history where the question is more divine. Because where is the edge of our eyes? Or where are the edge of our eyes? So in working with the imagination, for someone to master the mind, if you treat it as lifeless, it would just be repetition. But if you treat it as if it has a life, that means it's like you're an unknown intelligence, but you don't know how unknown this intelligence is. If the person, let's say, starts with 100%, like thinking that their knowledge is true, it's like they suddenly notice, okay, the percentage went down to like 90%, 10% unknown. Right, and so as that percentage goes to 50% unknown, 50% known, that's where I would say synchronicities begin to happen. If it goes to 100% unknown, which is technically beyond the body, it would be like an afterlife, but I would say or it would be afterlife, not the idea of afterlife, just what's afterlife. You befriend your mind and you reach a point where you can honor and care for the potential, non-learned potential of your intelligence. When one does this, it's poetically like a way where the person is lifting up, they are unburdening their own karma. That means imagine karma was being intense and cruel to the person, but the person was kind to karma. And it was as if suddenly the soul of the world, behaves differently. And really human beings are or I should say the main motive for souls is that they want to interact with souls. That means soul wants to find soul. Because it's that unknown origin of the unique way every person's animated that makes them incredibly, fascinating and valuable. Right, to me, it's as if we go to art galleries, and we're like, look at this art, but we don't realize every person's DNA is like an artwork in this world. And to me, everybody's like a next level painting that ideology can't draw. In befriending one's mind, one is technically communicating with an unknown, unconscious living force. It's like the person has this chill attitude where they're like, okay, I don't know what else there could be in other dimensions, whatever kind of entity or whatever, but all I know is that I am here, and because I am here, there's a presence and nature to what I am. And so if I trust this nature, in some sense I can move as it. Right? So it's another way of saying, before a person can even have this notion of using their mind, it's like you have to trust how to be a mind. There's a sort of confidence of being certain of the inner realm of the event, and then a confidence of expressing it out of that. It's very important that the quality of benevolence is acknowledged. If a person is not benevolent, or they haven't cultivated benevolence, which is another way of saying, like, what type of memories is the only making. Let's say you cultivate benevolence. Then, when you approach the mind will have a worthy allegiance. The mind will have something to honor. But if a person tries to master or control their mind and they're without a benevolent, authentic vibe, they're going to see that the mind can become an enemy. And the way the mind is an enemy is that the person's ignorance remains. You know, there's this Zen story where there's this Zen monk. He goes into this grassland and he's alone in the grasslands, and he sits down and meditates, and he suddenly gets this enlightening glimpse and he realizes something deeper about the world. He gets a sort of enlightenment. In this Zen story, the world has an interdimensional context, and so how the story goes is that the moment this Zen monk gets an enlightening, view, suddenly there's a dark minion in another dimension who freaks out and runs to the Dark Lord and tells the Dark Lord, this Zen monk has realized the true nature of reality with you. And so this is pretty much the moral of the Zen story. I read this online. The Dark Lord says, don't worry, regardless of what sort of next level insight the Zen monk has, human beings will make a belief out of what they see. And so this is really the type of human culture we need to move to, where it's as if there's no longer a fighting over how an ideology has to be specifically overlaid on reality. We give not the freedom of speech, we give a freedom of mind to view ideology, but part of that freedom of mind to view ideology, it's the idea of ourself. It's just the idea of the human being, and that idea has dust on it. What that means is we haven't wondered about a greater humanity. I don't remember in any of my just shows I've seen, in my youth, where there was an idea of okay, be an advanced being in an advanced world. It was as if the archetype of the advanced was being ignored. And, we're living at a time where podcasters are bannermen. I guess I'll say this, that imagine before a person masters their mind, it's as if their mind is acting like their master, right? And so, what is something attributed to the archetype of the master? Is that the master is conscious of the servant. So, again, to remind the context, the ancients saying the mind is not a master, but a great servant. So that means the master archetype is watching. It's like this. It's another way of saying the mind is not an object, so it's invisibly watching how the soul is. And so the idea is that if a person, just for a second, drops all ideology and says, wait a minute, I'm a new being in this world. And so what if the main way of pure behavior was in some sense to realize the effortless origin? It's as if the purpose of our lives has not been to be similar, you know? Through honest moments of living, through decency, the mind begins to comprehend and find capability to trust the soul. Once the mind trusts the soul, without the soul trying to be a master, it has become a master of its mind. And it's not a mastery based on the fear of control, but a mastery based on the love of freedom. That means, imagine there's some people who give freedom and then they just keep giving freedom. And eventually it reaches a point where it's as if there is nothing other than that freedom being the mover of the moment. You see, it's as if you start off as a human being and then you become, you know, how the cosmos points. We are the eyes of the universe that is alive. And we have feared this. Why? Because, you know, a technique denied us further exploration. Whether it's the scientific method, whether it's a religious story, whatever it is, we all know there's more to see. And as long as there's more to see, purpose is possible. That means just because there's unknown variables, it's as if we all have a playful approach. I'm telling you, the only type of sanity on this planet has to be a playfulness in accordance to the content of it. Why? Because if we take the story that we have placed upon the world too seriously, we unconsciously overreact to this as a sort of fear. So the idea is, if a person fears what they are, they cannot master their mind. And, you know, their body is like, you know, being kept by the divine or sleep. But if whoever's, let's say whatever being conscious, whatever type of consciousness hears this voice, there is a part of you right now as I am speaking that is being the original you. Now, if a person doesn't put any effort, let's say if anything a person does is artificial, if the person stops the artificial effort, they realize that original part, which is just being free from everything. That means we freed everything from everything. It's as if what is left is the laughter, an eternal laughter, but it's not the laughter of consequence. It's the laughter of what is being. You know, it's like just taking it in, that we're just creatures moving on a rock in the middle of nowhere, like hovering in the middle of nowhere, right? If like, And so easily we call the world names and we believe in it. One has to have an appreciation for all the dimensions of their life. Why? Because all the dimensions can be accessible to something. It's like the whole thing is happening here, even though we think we're a part of it. There is a supreme union beyond ideology. So there's an ideological oneness where you think every person is one, but that's ideological. Then there is a sort of oneness where prior to anybody being anything for anything to happen, the state is unconditional. So, the soul trusts itself, honors itself, and is benevolent to itself. Then, the mind, the invisible mind, poetically witnesses this. And the invisible mind will choose. That means it's another way of saying the inner realms we think it's just memories and our own visualizations, but it is not. It moves in accordance to emotions, and emotions have a capability to be like piano. Like imagine like a person playing a piano, and every note they play changed the emotions of the audience. Like this is probably a film I should direct. Once the unknown presence is true to itself, it does not lack peace. The mind abides by this peace, and it's another way of saying there was such a great thing, there was such a great moment happening that other moments came to bask in the greatness of that moment. For me, the idea of the advanced civilization is to like that. Through an original benevolence, which is another way of saying just the person is at ease. When the soul is at ease, it's like how the poet Rumi says the world is too full to talk about. It's too alive to be defined. once that contentment with the presence of one's original being is there, the mind invisibly watches to see the performance of the souls. It's pretty much like how the general behaves suggests the allegiance of the commander. Now, when it comes to the allegiance of the mind to the soul and the knowing of the soul, the general and commanding officer find the soldier, and the soldier, this comes to the metaphor of the human existence, is the physical body. Now, the idea is that the soldier has to trust the commanding officer, and has to also trust that the commanding officer knows what the general has told the commanding officer. The purpose of the body is to trust the mind, regardless of, where the instruction of the mind is coming from. Regardless of how chaos and order disharmonizes against the presence. It's as if some person may be like, Mr.Within, transcendence doesn't exist, and I'll be like, a transcendental presence does. We are existence, the experience of existence is as transcendental as the mind moving the body and the body projecting the mind. This is a transcendental activity. Any person who has dishonored the idea of soul, it's as if you didn't see how the future is beyond words. The body is here, and the free will is the instruction of the soul. The soul is 100% unknown. The commanding officer can be semi-known, but it's semi-unknown. And the soldier is 100% known. The body is 100% a physical event. We can't ignore this. The mind is semi-physical, inspired by physical content, but not physical. Invisible is, I think, a beautiful word to define the mind. And let's say the soldier trusts. The body trusts its mind. Imagine you're a human being, that your physical existence is aligned. You trust your mind, and then let's say you trust your soul. You trust even the unknown presence of your intention as much as its known compartments. And so the body is left with being free from all three dimensions once mastering all three, or being capable, or acknowledging all three. fully. Or maybe I should just say it this way. The motivation of our physical life is a trust in the invisible force that is being our intelligence. And the role of the mind, that means the body's job is to trust the mind. Just have faith in the instructions of the mind. The mind's job is to receive the instructions from the soul, poetically. And what the soul is a sort of, again, the eternal general archetype. For me, it's as if they say in theological traditions, God created the world. But for me, it's as if like God is a general, and it's like its command is the world's movement. Manifestation has an innate momentum that is prior to the origin stories. So let's say, just like planets, once the body, mind, and poetically the soul are aligned, it's another way of saying the freedom of an inconceivable dimension has been understood by an invisible, by the infinity of an invisible dimension. And now it's as if a sort of, it's like an inconceivable acceptance, or I should say it's an inconceivable it's like the invisible trusts the inconceivable, and the visible trusts the invisible. But technically it's like let me see what other words I could use. The soul commands the mind, and the mind commands the body. But the body doesn't know where the mind gets its commands from. So the body has no choice to trust the commanding officer, which is the inner rhythms of our psyche. Now the idea is that we are the soul of our mind that is moving our body. And we are simultaneously the mind that is moving for the body that can have a soul, and we're simultaneously the body that is in some sense playing out the divine agenda of manifestation. There is actually nothing to fear here, because intelligence is beyond an objective. It's like we're beyond the shapes that we fear. Because in a changing world, fear is it's unnecessary technically. It's all information, levels to information. Emotions arise due to, technically a loss, or it's like the emotion is a desire, but it's also the fear of the desire. When the body trusts the mind or follows the mind, when the mind, or here I'll say it this way, when the visible dimension of life honors, and honors like pure trust honors the invisible dimension of life, and when the invisible dimension of life honors the inconceivable dimension of life, then when the inconceivable dimension of life, when the general gives a command, it's like the willingness of the commanding officer and the willingness of the body. It's as if it's like a signal came from, it's like a command came from an inconceivable dimension into an invisible dimension. And then that invisible dimension, the command also went from the invisible dimension to the visible dimension, and the visible dimension is where the command was intended. It's another way of saying the soul is using the mind to move the body. So the question comes technically in all sort of mystical questioning, what is moving the mind? And without trust, it's like no portal can be found. And if somebody says, Mr. Within, you're using the soul as a general, is there a greater archetype? And I would say, the moment you notice there's an inconceivable momentum, or there's a momentum from an inconceivable dimension in the realm, it's as if when you feel, just like when somebody enters a room, the atmosphere of the room changes. Similarly, when a person notices, and not a visually unknown, but an inconceivable dimension, that means pretty much your mind finds the glitch in the simulation of its simulation, of how the brain is simulating something. You find the glitch in the system, that everything in the system is being instantaneously viewed as an unknown presence. This is equivalent to, like, you know, for me, if somebody says, Mr. Within, what would this spiritual experience feel like? It would feel like gravity is gone. It would literally feel like floating. Once in the lifetime of a conscious entity, during that lifetime, the moment that conscious entity discovers the nature of the unknown inconceivable presence, the moment you actually experience this, you will instantly know how much more there is, and how much of all of life's analysis in the observable universe is just the tip of the iceberg. Everybody's thinking spirituality means, like, I was like this guy in my past life, that person in my past life. It's all of that that goes away when you realize it's the tip of the iceberg. We're seeing past lives too. It's like the tip of the iceberg is not the iceberg. It's as if, like, before we are a persona, before we're a person in samsara, you know, trapped in a sort of world. It's as if, like, before we're that, there's no world to be trapped in. You remember the inconceivable technically. And when I say you remember, or I should say it this way, yeah, you notice the invisible and you remember the inconceivable. And when poetically the soul trusts the mind, and the mind trusts the body, and the body trusts the mind, and the mind trusts the soul, an incredible force arises. A force where I would say it's like if a spiritual person was like, does that person have an aura? No. That person has an interdimensional freedom access point. It's another way of saying when a person becomes liberated from one moment of life, they have technically become liberated from the similar dimensions of that moment that exist in all other moments. It's another way of saying once you find freedom, there's no longer a freedom that can be lost. It's like in the moment something is accessed, it's as if it cannot, technically, how would I say it? It's like mankind may forget, but the universe never will. The rivers of imagination lead to the ocean of the ultimate. This is another way of saying that the purpose of mind, so let's say we have 8 billion souls that have technically mastered their minds, which is another way of saying you have freedom from the production of your own mind. That means imagine a person releases any sort of emotional attachment to the content of their mind, they will become strangely and I don't know how to say this, but like an omnipresent witness of the self. You know, the hilarious thing is like we are in reality, but we're still seeking it. When it comes to honoring the soul, the mind has to trust the original intent. And something I have noticed, I don't know if others have noticed, but I have noticed that from the beginning of my life up to this moment right now, in all the ways I've existed in the space-time continuum, all the memories I have of myself in my youth, it's as if the emotion I have of myself was very different. And it's as if before ideological structures are solidified in the mind of the, let's say, young being, it's as if it has an emotional freedom to look at life. So think of this as if a person being capable to feel, like imagine there's a spectrum of emotion, and now imagine there's a spectrum of ideology. And the person has a freedom with moving both spectrums. More than ever, the world needs a greatness to chase. I have looked for greatness on this planet, and the only place I have found it is how the present walks into the future. And the idea is that every person begins treating themselves as initially a universalist. I would say my school of thought is a sort of very pure universalism. Impure universalism would still be entangled with some sort of narrative, with some sort of shape. But ultimately, it's not that we are alive. We are life. And life cannot die. You see what I'm saying? What dies is technically nothing. If something that is first found in nothing becomes nothing, it's like the something had nothing to lose. It's like because it's an unknown origin, and then a known life, and then an return to the unknown. We don't fear the unknown, we use it. Imagine somebody was smart enough to be like, yeah, I have a lot of fears, but I use them. And, people are like, what do you mean you use your fears? I realize what they're pointing at. And it's not that there's perfection in all dimensions, but it's just that life is ultimately a communication. It's like, that's what the conscious waking state is. The purpose of the conscious waking state is the advancement of communication. The purpose of the dream state is to, I would say, in some sense, experiential mobility. So freedom of movement, really. I remember, or here, I'll keep that story for another time. When mankind does not fear, how through kindness we can bring forth and advance humanity. That all that really Mr. Within is asking from the species is to care to look at yourself again and wonder why not to every impossibility. You know, that means right now, you know, I see a lot of these, you know, like there's these motivational videos on YouTube, and the person's like, just believe it and you can do it. Believe it, man. Believe it. You know, and on some level, it's like, okay, I want to build an advanced civilization. Believe it. It's more than belief. It's as if in my inner realms I have played around with prototypes. It ultimately comes down to a geometrical moment of beauty. It's like I have this view that the most beautiful idea on the planet will become the next mythos. That means it's like we went from the survival of the, you know, most bewildered animal to suddenly the conscious search for the greatest beauty. You know, you know, it's like there's a beauty, of course, like there's, you know, I've been blessed to see some very beautiful women in this lifetime. But there is a beauty to how consciousness is holding reality, not just geometrically, not just in 3D space, but it's like how the moment is happening has, I don't know how to say it. It's strangely, beautifully divine. How there's something to do in the void. And so the briefings beyond manifestation are complete. When a species got bored of fear, or let's say singular fear, and realized the potential of multidimensional love, which is another way of saying an advanced humanity, rather than fearing and not ignoring it, in some sense acknowledges all dimensions of life. It will become the greatest force in this universal sector. Imagine a non-judgmental force that in any situation of life just wonders about the advanced opportunity. If it's an emotional being, the most advanced state so far on this planet, we call it love. If you are an ideological being, you know, I would say it would be the word infinity. Or on some level, beauty, infinite beauty. That means as daunting as outer space is, it's also magnificent. Pretty much allow your honest and original being to decide, and there will be enough memories where the invisible witnessing of, let's say, the force of the logos, it's as if the mind of the universe will acknowledge our individual minds when we have stayed true to our own individual minds. I think it was Oscar Wilde where I remember he had this quote. I was saying, you know, Goodreads, the website with like a bunch of quotes on it. It's like there was also Marcus Aurelius and Einstein, but it was like Oscar Wilde had this quote where he said, "Be yourself, everybody else is taken." And so this being yourself goes beyond an ideological relationship. You know, pretty much Whether it's the body, mind, soul, without trust the world cannot turn. Trust is the ultimate resolution of all dimensions. It's as if there were chaotic beings and ordered beings, and we trusted the future that was beyond them. And since the future is inconceivable, technically it's like, whether you say it's an inconceivable idea of God, or it's an inconceivable idea of the world, or an inconceivable idea of self, the moment it accesses the inconceivable. It's like the hero's journey from consciousness is from the unknown to the known and then back to the unknown. Once we don't fear our unknown life, we can live it. When your eyes become your teacher, and then when your mind becomes your teacher, and then when you realize the greatest teaching, your own soul. Free we have been, for the illusion and the simulations needed to start from somewhere. Truth does not waver. Much blessings and namaste.